Billy Blue, my knight in shining brindle. Welcome to another episode of A Poet Reads to Write. Today I would like to take part in that fantastic new initiative framed in September. I have always written a lot of ekphrastic poetry. I've always been very, very interested in the fine arts. And I've written, as I said, a lot of poetry about it. Particularly, a lot of ekphrastic poetry can be found in this collection of poetry, my current collection, called Cactus. Today, I thought I might share a sequence of ekphrastic poems that I wrote about a school of early middle 20th century Australian fine artists, particularly focused in Sydney, and they were in particular focused around a distinctly odd conduit of Norman Lindsay. From today's point of view, it can be very difficult to understand the magnetic power and draw that Norman Lindsay exercised over the whole Australian fine arts community in that early 20th century milieu. But at that time, he was the #1 man in the whole show. Basically, in Sydney arts, writing, and Australia more generally, really, you couldn't get off the ground, you couldn't get a career in the fine arts off the ground if you didn't have the approval and support of Norman Lindsay. He was that important. His star has probably dimmed quite a bit in recent years, and he is not seen today, I don't think, as a really significant major player in the fine arts community in Australia. But if you are a historian of the fine arts, you could not write a history of fine arts and of writing, particularly poetry, in that early middle 20th century without much interest in the character, the figure of Norman Lindsay. Today, neuroscientists and philosophers are really interested, aren't they, in things like consciousness and free will, and trying to explain, define what they are and how they work and what's their relationship even to one another. In the early 20th century, interest was really in life and trying to define exactly what is life. What is the difference between something that is inanimate and something that is all of a sudden animate? And there was the beginnings of the scientific method and trying to really explore and define life from a scientific point of view, this new scientific method that was really getting off the ground from the period of the Renaissance. So this school of particular fine artists were really interested in what they called vitalism, which was one way of explaining what is life. What is the difference between the animate and the inanimate? And for these people like Norman Lindsay, it was about vitalism. It goes back, doesn't it, in England to people like D.H. Lawrence. And then it goes all the way back philosophically to Henri Bergson and to, of course, Friedrich Nietzsche. Vitalism was a really important philosophical movement in world philosophy at that late 19th century into the middle 20th century. And as I said, the distinctly odd conduit for all of these big ideas in world philosophy and science in Australia was the character of Norman Lindsay. Some of you might remember there was a very popular film made about Norman Lindsay a decade or two ago called Sirens, and it starred Sam Neill as Norman Lindsay, and as one of the artist models it starred Elle Macpherson. So it was a very popular film, quite a hagiographic film, because Norman Lindsay was a distinctly odd character, which we will begin to explore now. So my sequence of poems about this whole thing is called I Am the Vine. The other interesting thing about Australia in that early middle 20th century thing is that many white Australians, European Australians, were very interested in somehow engaging with the classical world of, Rome and Greece, and of somehow transporting it, bringing it, holtus boltus, into Australia and putting it into the Australian bush. So painters, painted Pan dancing in the bush, and there was all these attempts to bring the gods into Australia. And Norman Lindsay was very interested in this classical revivalism and transporting that classical world of Greece and Rome into the Australian context. Of course, as well as being about vitalism and all this sort of thing, Norman Lindsay was very influenced by such movements in the fine arts as, Art Nouveau, Symbolism, Art Deco, as well as classical revivalism. And of course, like so many people in that period, he lost two brothers in World War I on Flanders Field, and he never got over the loss. And like, probably almost everyone in that world, everyone lived with trauma, didn't they? Everyone lived with great grief as a response to the horrors of World War I. And of course, as well as the beginnings of the scientific method with Sherlock Holmes and, all of these sorts of things as they entered into popular culture. That new scientific method. There was also a real interest in this period in spiritualism, in communing with the dead, and desperately somehow trying to make contact again with all those loved ones that had been lost in the Great War. So all of these things about vitalism and life and what is the definition of life, all of these things are coming into this thing. My family has a history in the Blue Mountains going back to before World War II. My family moved from Sydney up to the Blue Mountains, just west of Sydney, as I said, before World War II. And my pa, who was an upholsterer and who then trained my dad as an upholsterer as well, because I always wanted these upholsterer sons, apprentice sons. My pa, one of his early customers when he moved to the Blue Mountains was, of course, Norman Lindsay. The interesting thing, of course, is that my pa was Jewish. And he had a really good rapport with Norman Lindsay. He did work for Norman Lindsay for many years. Norman Lindsay was one of his pride of place customers because he was such a celebrity in the Blue Mountains, even though he was quite a controversial celebrity because of his preference for painting the nude model, and that really upset many morals in that early 20th century Sydney, church-dominated milieu. But Pa was Jewish as well as an upholsterer, and he always loved Norman Lindsay, and Norman Lindsay always apparently treated Pa very respectfully. They had a really close rapport. Pa would often be given books by Norman Lindsay as little gifts, and because Norman Lindsay could see maybe he was interested in what was going on, and it was just really, really interesting. Pa later on was very distressed when I showed him some of Norman Lindsay's very strong anti-Semitic writings, because Norman Lindsay was a great hater. He hated wowsers, but he also hated feminism, he hated modernism, he hated Jews. It's a very, very odd thing. So my poem begins as a prologue. I am the vine, and my poem is Bacchus in the Antipodes. That is my subtitle. And this first poem is called The Prologue, when Jews for Jesus call on the oracle of Springwood. My pa, though a strong Jewish man, converted to Christianity. And as I said, he was an upholsterer whose one of his most loved customers was Norman Lindsay. So prologue, when Jews for Jesus call on the oracle of Springwood. After Norman Lindsay at home in the Blue Mountains, and this poem is dedicated to Leslie, or my pa, Aaron Gordon Hall, grandson of the Rabbi Aaron Alexander Levi. Pa and Dad were chapel small, upholsterers who barracked for the herd, and news of the death of God never arrived. Furthermore, when at the home of Mr. and Mrs. Lindsay for work, inducement to sinful peeping away from the sitting room's deep-buttoned antiques and model boats must have been pondered as alien, but Pa, that Jewish whiz raconteur, always returned to rich, roaring laughter and impeccable manners, and Mr. Lindsay always paid on time. Over the years, Mr. Lindsay gave Pa little gifts. One was a luxuriantly illustrated and inscribed book, a personal memoir of Springwood Olympus by a Mr. Douglas Stewart, who Pa met one weekend when delivering some work. Pa detected my contrary flow, my hard love with Dad, and I grew to his gentle words and gifted book, anxieties arching over us like a bond. In this book, I met Norman's feckless charm and formidable saintliness, dressed as an irascible devil scamp, and quarrels leapt from crag to crag as his Roman beaked nose sniffed out a cautionary Atlantis, decadence and cataclysm that might have bled from our revelation. I was fastened like a spiritualist, haunting Flanders. But my yo-yo relationship with bohemianism was doomed. The Baptists had the child, so owned the man. And anyway, Pa was forever at our breakfast table with toast and pots of tea, cheering us on with his Oliver Twist stories of himself as Jubo. Such hurt Philatri's pride manifest as our patriarchal archangel, fiddling on the roof of what we might become. Pa was an incredible man. He had such a big influence on me as a little kid. Norman Lindsay, of course, he believed in reincarnation. He thought he was a reincarnated spirit from Atlantis. Just fascinating. It's so quirky. From a historical point of view, I just love the whole Norman Lindsay thing and what Norman Lindsay represented in the beginnings of, early middle 20th century Sydney fine arts. It's so interesting to engage with, but distinctly odd, and he would have hated me as a Jewish man. Poem 1, Springwood Olympus, Norman Lindsay, 1879 to 1969, or the Umbamesht in the land of the Golden Fleece. Norman Lindsay loved Nietzsche. Theirs is a gunfire breakfast and Mediterranean climate, luxuriating in the cavalcade of bush spirits and riotous protectionism, with a bent for ad-libbing and hullabaloo, in sandstone Romanesque villa complex, with narrow bull-nosed verandas. Such a clutch of golden drowsiness in terraced gardens, but the pool is leak-prone, and darting around ionic columns, there's a satyr pursuing nymph in strength through joy, boudoir fantasy, criminal climax. This fiery faith in puffery, reawakened in caress and libidinous release, is their overblown nostalgia, fouling common sense. And a colossus is wished for to straddle their heads in bellicose anti-modernism, because muscle is eugenics and eurythmics the weight to prey on wowsers, while Hyperboreans fix a sun on ripening fruit and unbroken masculine happiness. In their Hellenism, rollicking visions of Anglo artist men as gods, miserly and spindly saplings, untremelled by gumtree tyrants, are a wistfully melancholic, faded, zooming Superman, harbour idyll, mesmerised by a pure, healthy race of mirror men, never grown flaccid. As a vitalist, Norman Lindsay was very interested in that source of male sexual potency. A very distinct, interesting person. He really reacted against the bush ballad tradition of, people like Henry Lawson, Banjo Patterson. He hated the bush ballad tradition. Poem 2, Homer's Sorceress, Bertram McKennell, 1863 to 1931. Or the poem is subtitled Circe Delivers. Bertram McKennell was a very famous Melbourne-based sculptor. Lived much of his adult life, though, in London. He was very influenced by the Rodin school of naturalism in modern sculpture. He was a beautiful sculptor, and this is a poem in response to a fantastic sculpture of Circe in the very act of transforming the men of Odysseus into swine. Very influenced again in in symbolism and that sort of the image of Circe as that image of the femme fatale in Art Nouveau's fine arts that was so popular in this period. Daphne was his perfectly proportioned wet dream, inciting divine violence, excused by him as she is arrested at the moment of transformation, flight into a tree, her closed eyelids, his projected erotic frisson. And his Diana wounded is a flesh and blood beauty, a coy and lithesome, unclothed, modern Edwardian woman, spied on and bent over in the act of removing garter or stocking, a poeticized in bronze, nude girl's neon. Such hypnotic scale and swagger in bronze abundance of alchemy, like a charm that he expects will return those full-blooded voluptuous types ready for capture. And Circe seals the deal, a high stakes, full frontal nude on an ornamented relief drum, her feet and hips squared, head garlanded with asps and commanding outstretched arms, rigid in their pride, witchcraft. This is his cautionary tale, as her demonic, engulfing force has chaotic man tumbling from grace and fornicating swinishly amid all those coiled snakes. Being early middle 20th century male-dominated arts, a lot of it, the imagery is quite sexist, isn't it? It's a difficult art to interrogate from a 21st century point of view. But this is the milieu of this early middle 20th century Sydney art scene. Poem 3, Goulburn Odysseus, Sydney Long, 1871 to 1955, buried somewhere in London's Streatham Cemetery. Such a charming, great fibber of short, gammy stature, masked under an Anglophile's top hat and sinuous line. I imagine his self-portrait, framed by misadventure, as he is strapped to a mast of evangelical enmity, the church siren scrobble of unhinged, contrary winds. He is enthroned, a lavishly robed cave-in of doubt, while behind him a halo is dissolving twilight, the dancing crooks and curves of naked, translucent youths, silhouetted against the lyrical sweep of foggy melancholia. His is a gumnut nouveau, bitter in the detour of gothically illuminated and acclimatized nymphs and naiads, a bucolic, lilting slope, transforming reeds and water lilies into the pipes of Pan. Amidst these rhythmic serpentine necks of brolgas and flamingos, a pond reflects a raging bushfire, and from the silhouettes of spindly trees, a shadowy rivulet bleeds canvas dry. Poem 4, a sartor's thumbs down to a laughless god, Frank Guy Lidge, 1895 to 1967, and this doom of youth. He was a veteran who had fought in World War I. His brother is the very famous Guy Lynch who died. He was drowned on Sydney Harbour. He fell drunken off a ferry one night and drowned in the harbour. His body was never found. Ken Slessor, a very famous Australian poet, wrote the great eulogy for Lynch, Five Bells. It's one of the all-time great classics of Australian early, mid-20th century Australian poetry. A sartor's thumbs down to a laughless god. Cross the Sydney Opera House forecourt and enter the gardens near the Manor War steps. There's a Gallipoli veteran with shaggy-haired, cloven-hoofed legs and well-muscled pagan lust, rocking back on his bronzed haunches, eyes shut deliciously in post-coital ease, semen purling from flaccid cock. very interesting, this famous sculpture in the entrance to the Sydney Botanical Gardens, it's often seen as by parents and shown to their children as a sort of a Mr. Tumnus from the, the C.S. Lewis's Narnia world. It's anything but a Mr. Tumnus, an innocent Mr. Tumnus in children's literature. It's a very, very much loved sculpture at the entrance to the Botanical Gardens down near the Sydney Opera House. It's a beautiful sculpture, but it is very much about that, again, male potency. Poem 5, Sunbaker, Max Dupain, 1911 to 1992, or The Strapping Sons of Neptune. Max Dupain's a very famous Sydney photographer in this same period, very influenced by Norman Lindsay's ideas around vitalism and eugenics, that racist thing about breeding and, supposedly good breeding. Someone like me would not have fitted the bundle at all. This is for Max Dupain, Sunbaker, which is after one of his most famous photograph portraits. With a son and daughter ripening on the vine, and a wife for teething infants, his revolt against the herd assumed the weight of an afternoon's sun-struck torpor. His was the perfect muscular glory, an impulse to disrupt the flywheel of mechanized murderous war, to return man to a lifesavers, drills, patrol and parade, where a march past could again be a flourish of speedos and caps fastened under chesty bond jaws. He had seized the antidote to degeneracy and nightmares, trench-struck in an order both natural and fortunate for him, her indrawn demeanour and gift of breasts, animating luminous spill, a glowing band arching through his dreams. In this lineage of classical proportions, he was lucky, like one of the gods and their gang, charging through surf, honourably discharged in the ease of a manly, sunlit afternoon. Max Dupain, again, a very odd person. Beautiful photography in that beginnings of art photography in early, middle 20th century Sydney fine arts. Very, very important photographer, but had some very distinctly racist ideas around vitalism and eugenics. Very, very odd. Poem 6, The Boy Aries. The Aries, the great war god. Jack Lindsay, 1900 to 1990, who wrote 100 books to dream us peace. Jack Lindsay was Norman Lindsay's eldest son from one of his first marriages, and Jack Lindsay is my man amongst all the Lindsays. Jack gave him, so he was initially completely given over to Norman Lindsay's ideas around eugenics and vitalism, and he was the great philosopher who wrote the great, if you like, call to action for the great gospel of Norman Lindsay. But Jack Lindsay, as a young man, very quickly turned to Marxism and communism, and he was very influenced by that, particularly existentialist philosophy as well, and somehow trying to bring like Sartre himself, bringing existentialism and Marxism together into a grand vision for understanding how the liberation could come. Norman Lindsay hated Marxism, and he completely disowned Jack. They had a complete break, and Jack moved to London to get away from Norman and live the rest of his life in London as a writer, a biographer, historian, cultural historian, all that sort of thing. And they never ever reconciled. Jack Lindsay is a very, very significant historian and philosopher in his own right, and had a complete cut-off from Norman. So, The Boy Aries. This is for Jack Lindsay. My man. Of all the Lindsays revelling in their picnic of acclimatized gods, the one I dreamed was Jack, fleeing home to far off English shores. A precarious childhood in a brood abandoned by the oracle of Springwood, who had found a younger model wife. Jack watched mother drink a hurdy-gurdy babble, shearing shame, as he pleaded to be plebeian and worthy to father's aristocracy of talent. For father, blood was spirit and ubiquitous. He was leery and demoralised in a Flanders fathomless brutality, and the darker moments of a shadowy Sartre's lacerated mind. Stuck in a scum of horror, father forced away. He attacked modernismus in a one-man renaissance. I affirm life, I affirm beauty. And in the Ouija board, he desperately re-erected the bones of family faith. And from this taxing, bombastic banner, snagged in the barbed wire deterrence at the gap's brink, Jack begged permit. But he had chosen a path of deviationist sin, compassion, and so would remain to father a shameful fringe phenomenon. Oh, I love Jack Lindsay. Just stood up for himself at the end and had that big split, was finally able to get away from Norman and have that split, become his own man. I love that. Norman Lindsay, of course, hated modernism. He hated anything obscure. Couldn't stand Ezra Pound, even though he was as madly anti-Semitic as Ezra Pound. Such odd people. But it's, these artists, they are odd. But they're artists that are just so important in the cultural history of the Australian fine arts milieu that they're not artists that I can turn my back on. And many of them, Norman Lindsay's reputation has fallen a lot. But many of them, like, for example, Max Trepayne, Bertram McKennell, their reputations are as strong as ever. They're still much loved artists. And of course, Norman Lindsay didn't only influence the fine arts. He was equally influential on the poets, particularly poetry, some other writers as well, but in particular poetry. And, major talents like Ken Slessor were totally under the thrall of Norman Lindsay and of his eugenics, his vitalism, all of these sorts of very odd ways of looking at the world from our point of view. Epilogue, Aphrodite's Renaissance, for Judith Wright, and this poem is also dedicated for my nana, Alma Hall, née Taylor. This poem also, I love the idea of Judith Wright. Judith Wright as a young woman. Judith Wright's a very, very important Australian poet, mid-20th century Australian poet. This is her collected poem. She's a wonderful, wonderful poet. Very important, and she's sort of the bridge in many ways between that bush ballad tradition and coming up to a more modernist, sophisticated poetry. So she wrote many poems, early poems particularly. There was sort of this gateway, if you like, from the bush ballads to a more modern way of experiencing and being in the world. A beautiful poet. She became a great, before green politics were even really invented, she was a very important conservationist, and she really can be seen as a very significant, I think, eco-poet in her own right. Very, very important historian. She was a very critical historian of Norman Lindsay and of the magnetism, the power that he exercised over so many early, particularly Sydney poets like Ken Slessor. So when Judith Wright came to write a lot of histories and engage with the beginnings of Sydney poetry, Australian poetry, she was very critical of Norman Lindsay and really was trying to have that break from Norman Lindsay and have a poetry, a poetics that was able to develop away from this magnetic thing with Norman Lindsay. Judith Wright has done, this is an autobiography that she wrote, Half a Lifetime. It's a wonderful thing to read. Particularly the way, as a young woman growing up in 1930 Sydney, going to Sydney University, she really engaged with the whole thing of Norman Lindsay and tried to work out what was going on there. And eventually, as I said, she came to reject Norman Lindsay, and she wanted to understand what was going on with Norman Lindsay so that she knew what she was rejecting, was able to develop her own poetics completely apart. This is probably the great biography of Judith Wright, South of My Days, a biography of Judith Wright by Veronica Brady. This is the great biography of Judith Wright, I guess. quite a conservative biography, but it's beautifully written. It's a book I love. And then only in the last 10 years this has come out. This is a brand new biography of Judith Wright by Georgina Arnott, called The Unknown Judith Wright. And Georgina Arnott in this book really recovers the very young, feisty Judith Wright. As I said, the young teenager and early adult Judith Wright, who was a student at Sydney University and was beginning to really read and try and understand Norman Lindsay, so she knew what to reject and was beginning to begin her own poetics away from Norman Lindsay. And she was also very interested, unlike Norman Lindsay, who, you know, everything about sexuality was very much about the male gaze and, you know, about the male focus, about the phallus for Norman Lindsay. But for Judith Wright, she was very interested in looking at sexuality from a very female point of view, and particularly from the point of view of a young woman. You know, she wasn't, you know, she missed being a flapper in the 1920s. She was a bit young, but she was very much that 1930s modern woman. Really interesting, very serious, very interesting person. So this is my poem for Judith Wright, as a way of, if you like, interrogating some of the values, the sexist values of Norman Lindsay and of that whole male milieu of early artists. So this is my epilogue to the sequence. Aphrodite's Renaissance, because for me Aphrodite is Judith Wright. For Judith Wright and for my Nana, Alma Hall Nay Taylor. Nana was no flapper. Pa didn't like cheeky girls. He wanted a shy life, as his father was tanked up. So before you could say Jack Robinson, Pa fell in love, looking her up and down. You know, he said, if I found the right girl, I wouldn't ask her to change. I'd follow. Ironically, Aphrodite incited Norman more than Pa. She was a bugle call, calling out bluster. She opposed wowsers too, but his manifesto to remake only traumatized, broken white men into hyper-vigorous, sinewy hero artists was a false start and no gain at all. His invocation of classical bodies was a dazzling cardboard, fake and impasse, where hoplites mounted pedestals of concrete boots, and where she was forever foil to a gallery of villains. She was no shy Nana, and like Norman, keen to abandon old fogeyism and cast off constrictive clothing. But unlike him, she would claim a sure-footed and shared fitting together. She would rejoice with Nana in the scattering sparks of her own voyage out. Judith Wright. Judith Wright, such an important artist, and I just love that, you know, in her histories of early Australian poetry, in the beginnings of developing her own really theoretical poetics, you know, she really struggled with the whole notion of Norman Lindsay and what he represented. She really read deeply into his, you know, eugenics and vitalism, all those odd philosophies that have been rejected now, largely at least. But she read deeply in that, so she knew what she wanted to reject, and then she started to build her own poetics, her own way of being a young modern woman in this world. Judith Wright is just such a significant, such a major person, and for me it was fun looking back on, you know, Norman Lindsay, all of those people, using the prism, if you like, of Judith Wright as a young woman in 1930 Sydney University. So that's my sequence of poems to that Norman Lindsay school of vitalist Sydney poetry and early fine arts in the sort of early middle 20th century. It can be found in this book called Cactus. So that's my contribution to Framed in September. It's a fantastic initiative, and I was really pleased and excited to take part in this. I just think it's an amazing project, and hopefully it'll carry on again next year. So thank you, and bye for now.